Masechet Yevamot Daf Ayin. With this daf, we complete the 7th perek and we'll begin the 8th. And we start with the interesting case. Itmar haba al arusato bebet chamiv. You have a couple, they did kiddushin, and in olden days, they would often wait several months between kiddushin and nisuin till everyone got everything in order. And this guy was a bit impatient, and he has bi'ah with his fiancée in his future father-in-law's house. So that's not a good thing. Rav Amad Habalad Mamzer, and it further turns out that she becomes impregnated by that bi'ah. What will be the status of that child? Rav says, Mamzer. Shmuel Amad Habalad Shituki. Shmuel's a little bit more lenient. Shituki means we don't know who the father is, so only a Safek Mamzer. Although a Safek Mamzer is in some ways worse because a Mamzer can at least marry a Mamzeret. A Safek Mamzer cannot even do that. Now, why are they so strict about this? Well, what would be the problem? The problem is that we suspect that, in fact, maybe this guy is not actually the father. The arus is not actually the father. Maybe she slept with someone else while she was there. And if it is someone else, then it's a mamzer. If it really is the father, it's not a mamzer. But Rav says we have to suspect in such a case. Amar Rava mistabera milte de Rav de daima me'alma avalo daima me'alma batra dideh shadinaneh. Now, if this sounds a little bit too strict, Rav's ruling here, Rava will agree that it also is too strict at face value. And he said, listen, what Rav says makes sense, that it would be a mamzer. That is only if there is a rumor that she did sleep around with people in the world and not her fiancé. That's the problem. But if there is no rumor that she slept with others, then we can follow her word, and we can assume that it is in fact the betrothed is the father, that we trust their words. Okay, good. So that's Rava limits it. Amar Rava, mina mina la. Now, has Rava know? What's this proof that it can't be that just in a regular case, and unless we have a bad rumor, it can't be a regular case, you just say it's a mamzer. How do we know that? Midikatani yalda tochal, because we have in our Mishnah, if a Kohen has bi'ah with a bat Yisrael, not in marriage, they just have bi'ah, and she has a child with him, then she can eat terumah. Even though they're not married, we assume that he is the father, and therefore this child will be a connection of this mother to a Kohen, and she can actually eat terumah. Now, hechidami, what kind of case is our Mishnah talking about? If there's a rumor that this woman slept around with other people in the world, yalda amai tochal. So then when she gives birth, why should we assume that the father is a Kohen? Maybe not. Who knows who it is? Elalav mine daima vela daima me'alma. Rather, it must be that Mishnah is assuming that there's a rumor that it's from him. This Kohen is the father, and not a rumor with others. And so you see here that as long as there's the rumor is most people, the word going around is that in fact this guy the arus is the father, then we assume that it is, and then the kid would be kosher. So when Rav says the kid is mamzer, it must be talking about where there was a rumor that she was sleeping with other people in the world. All right, so Rava makes sense. That's a good proof. Uma hatam delahai isura ulahai isura batra didesha dinane hacha delahai isura ulahai hetera kol lokol sheken. And now we even strengthen that proof because these two cases are not even equivalent, but rather our case is even stronger, because in that case of the Mishnah where she had no connection with any man. She was not arusa, so she's equally prohibited to this particular Kohen as she is to anyone else, any other Yisrael. She's single, he's single, so it's a prohibition of yichud. And if yichud is prohibited, all the more so bi'ah. So it's an equal prohibition, and yet we assume because of the rumor that in fact, it must be that this Kohen is the father, and that's what we assume, and she can even eat terumah based on that. Whereas here, the lahai isura, lahai hetera, she is prohibited to be with anybody else because she's arusa, whereas she is permitted to be with her arus. And so, all the more so, we should assume that if the rumor is that it was in fact the arus who's the father, and that is a permitted relationship, so it makes sense that with that, in a case of doubt and a rumor that he is in fact the father, we should trust the rumor, and the kid should not be a mamzer. So therefore, Rava proves that this is a case where the rumor is against her. The rumor is that she was with other people in the world. Okay, Amar le'Abaye, Le'olam emalach kol hechad dedamya mineh, af agav dela damya me'alma, Amar Rav havalad mamzer. My ta'ama. Abaye says, no, I disagree with you. I could actually argue differently. That any time there's a rumor that the arus is the father, then even if there's no rumor from the rest of the world, then the child will actually be a mamzer. Why? Since if she already admitted that she was with her arus before they were married, and so if she would abandon herself in such a negligent way regarding the arus, and that she admitted she admitted to that, then it makes sense that she would abandon herself and not be careful with who she's sleeping with, even to other people in the world. And therefore Abaye takes a much stricter interpretation of Rav. Umatnitin shayu shenehem chabushin bebet ha'asurin. So our Mishnah, what do you do with that? Because Rav brought a good proof from our Mishnah with a Kohen who has bi'ah with a bat Yisrael, who are both single, and yet we assume he is the father and she can eat teruma. He says, our Mishnah, I could explain that it's talking about a case where they both were in prison together, and therefore there was no possibility that she fathered this child with anybody else, because she couldn't physically be with anybody else. All right, that's a bit of a push to say our Mishnah is only when they were in jail. But that's what Abaye claims, and so Abaye says the stricter interpretation of Rav. Okay, good. All that is one version of their machloket and their interpretation of Rav and Shemuel, and now we have a second one. Ika de amre beba aleha kule amma lo pligi de batre dide shadinan leh. According to this version, everyone agrees that if he, the arus, admits that he was with her and he is the father, then according to all opinions, there is no disagreement that we follow him. We follow that the child is his, and therefore is not a mamzer, is perfectly fine. So as long as he admits to it, that's okay. So this version is much more lenient than the original version. The original version, even if he says, yeah, I'm the father, but we still suspect there's also a suspicion that she was with other people. There's a rumor about that. Or according to, that's Rava. According to Abaye, just because he admitted to it, that itself is actually a negative, because it shows that she was not careful. If she was loose with her arus, maybe she was loose with other people. So in the first version, this did not even help. But in the second version, as long as he admits to being the father, then we assume that he is the father and the child is kosher. So where's the machloket? Arusa she'ibera. We're talking about where she became pregnant and he does not admit to it. In that case, what do we do? Rav amad havalad mamzer, Shmuel amad havalad shetuki. See, now it's more understandable why Rav says it's a mamzer. Shmuel says safek mamzer. Okay, so they disagree only regarding the extent to which we are sure or not or unsure, but both say it's a problem. In this version, Rava will limit Rav as follows: where we do not have a rumor from that he is the father, meaning he did not admit to it, and there is a rumor that she was with other people, so that's double bad. But if there's rumor that the arus was the father, he says so, I'm the father, and even though there is also a rumor that she was sleeping around with other people, nevertheless, we follow him, and that's totally fine. So this greatly limits Rav, and it's really only when he says, not mine, and she's rumored to be with others, then that makes a lot of sense. That is good likelihood that it's a mamzer, maybe even for sure. Amar Rava, minami nala. Rava now brings his proof from our Mishnah. Tekatani yalda tochal. We had a case of a single woman who was with the single Kohen, and she has a child from him. She can eat terumah. We assume that he is the father. What kind of cases are talking about? The Mishnah doesn't specify. If the Kohen admits, yes, I am the one, so it's rumored to be that he is the father, and there is no rumor that she was with anybody else, no reason to suspect that. You have to tell me this case. It would be an obvious case. Obviously, he's the father. And these cases aren't necessarily so obvious because we have to learn the very halacha that even though they're not married, still could allow her to eat terumah. Okay, but anyway, that would be too much of an obvious case. Must be talking about where the father said, yes, I'm the father, even though there are also rumors that she was with others. We believe the father, and that's a proof. Even to strengthen the proof, it's a kal vachomer. In this case, in the case of our Mishnah, where she is equally prohibited to this Kohen as she is to any other single guy who was a Yisrael. Nevertheless, we assume that he is the father. So in our case, that we're talking about where she is in Arusa, in her father's house, and she is permitted to her Arus, so we should assume that it was the Arus, and go the easy way, that she would have, if she was going to be do something prohibited, so she would do so with the arus, which is only a derabanan, low-level prohibition, rather than eshet ish, which it would be with anybody else. So all the more so, we should trust that he is in fact the father. And in this version, Amar le'Abaye, le'olam emalach kol hechad dedamia me'alma, afagav dedamia mineh, Amar Rav Havalad Mamzer Umatnitin Bidela Daima Kelal. Rava here is one step more stringent, just as he was much more stringent in the previous version. And he said, according to this version, Abaye argues back and says we should be a bit more stringent. And I can tell you that as long as there is a rumor that she was with other people in the world, even if there's also a rumor that it was that the Arus was the father, even if the Arus admits, yes, I am the father, but that rumor that she was promiscuous with other people in the world is not good and is going to ruin her. And Rav would say the child is a mamzer, as opposed to Rava, who said, as long as Arus admits that he's the father, we trust it. Abaye says no, a counter rumor is going to make it no good, according to Rav. And now how is Abaye going to explain the Mishnah? And the Mishnah that Rava cited as a proof for himself, Abaye could say, no, the Mishnah is talking about a simple case where there's no rumor at all, there's no rumor she was with other people or anything, or with him, and so we just, based on no information, we can assume that he's the Kohen. But a negative rumor that she was with other people, that ruins it, even against a positive rumor, admission by the father that he is in fact, by the Kohen, that he is in fact, or the Arus says in father, in this case, the Kohen, that he is in fact the father. Okay, and so that concludes the two versions of the interpretations of that machloket. And now we go on and look for sources for the other laws in the Mishnah. Ha'aved posel mishum bi'ah. That if a slave is with a woman, then that will cause her to be disqualified from eating terumah and marrying a Kohen. Maitama, how do you know that? And furthermore, if they have children, those children are not considered hers, and they will not prevent her from going back to her previous status. If she was a Bat Yisrael and her husband died, then she stops. If she was a Bat Kohen and her husband died, she goes back and she can eat terumah, even though they have a child who is an Eved, because we don't consider lineage to be significant. How do we know that? Amar Kerai Shavi Ladeha Tihye Ladoneha. If you have a Eved Ivri who goes free, and we say even while he was a slave, he was given a wife and children. When he goes free, he has to leave those children behind. They stay with their mother, which means that the status of the children go with the mother. And if the mother is a slave, then they remain slaves and would not be related to the father. So they don't have lineage, and that would explain this case. Okay. Mamzer posel u'ma'achil. We saw that a mamzer, if someone is with a woman, it will cause her to be disqualified. On the other hand, a child or grandchild who is a mamzer is considered a son, is considered a living heir, so that the grandmother will retain the status of the person she was married to. Okay, tenor banan vezera en la en li elazara zera zara minayin tamod lomar vezera en la mikom makom. So where do we know all this? From that pasuk in Vayikra 22:13. We learned that having a child makes a difference to her status. This bat kohen ki el mana gurusha vezera en la. If she leaves a bat kohen, she leaves her Yisrael husband, or he dies, and she has no children, then she can go back. So vezera en la. So from those words, we can learn a couple of things. Number one, vezera en la. I only know that means her child. What about her grandchild? Does that count as a surviving child that will connect her to her deceased husband? How do we know that? Well, because the pasuk says vezera en la. If she has no child at all, no grandchild even, then she can go back to her previous status. Otherwise, she remains with her husband's status. Fine. And the elazera kasher zera pasul minayin. I only know that kosher children count from a legal relationship. How do you know that an unfit child like a mamzer also would count as a child and keep her connected to her previous husband? Tamudoma vezera en la ayen ala. If she has no children at all, meaning we make a play on words, and ayen, that we have to go and examine and look for anyone, even that kid that we don't want to admit to because they're a mamzer, right? Go and check the lineage, go and check the records, and we find, oh, look, there is a child who's a mamzer. That also counts to keep her connected to whatever her status her husband was. Now, question. Hold on, you just used this phrase for two different things. You already used it to teach that grandchildren count. זרע זרעה לא הסתריך קרא. בני בנים הרי הן כבנים, כי הסתריך קרא לזרע פסול. So we asked, you can't use it twice. He says, you're right. For grandchildren, we don't actually need a pasuk, because we saw a general principle that grandchildren have the same legal status as children. And so therefore, we only need the pasuk to include a mamzer, that they will keep her connected to her husband's status. Now, our Mishnah, if you remember, used an example of how do you produce a grandchild who's a mamzer? Well, if you have this bat Yisrael who had a daughter, and she was with an Eved or Akum, they produce a mamzer. Well, this is not agreed upon by everyone, that an Eved and Akum, that's a Isur Lav. Who says that will produce a mamzer? Only Rabbi Akiva says that. So as that to say, our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. I mean, the Mishnah could have easily picked a different example of actual erva. But I picked this example maybe because this is we have cases like this above, so it's more contextually appropriate. So Rabbi Akiva is the one that says that even yesh mamzer mechayav elavin, even isur lav, like being with a non-Jew, produces a mamzer. So, but we don't really want our Mishnah to be only Rabbi Akiva, so we say afilu temer Rabbanan, be'eved kochavim ve'eved modu, even Rabbanan who disagree regarding isur lav, other isur lavin do not produce a mamzer, like Machazir Gerushato. But even they would agree that a non-Jew or Eved Kanani would make the child a mamzer. How do you know that? Because in fact, when the sages came, they said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi that a non-Jew with a Jewish woman will make the child a mamzer. Okay, that is the conclusion here, even though on Daf Mem He it was not so concluded. We saw that was actually continued to be his machloket back there, and this is not the halacha here. Okay, Kohen Gadol pe'amim sheposel. And so the last example in the Mishnah was that someone can have a grandson who is a Kohen Gadol, and yet the existence of that Kohen Gadol grandson will connect the grandmother to her husband, who was to her husband who was a Yisrael. And if the Kohen Gadol didn't exist, she could go back to being a Bat Kohen, go back to her father's house. So having a grandson who's a Kohen Gadol, she has to lament over this fact, because now she cannot eat terumah. I'm sure she's proud that she has a Kohen Gadol, but it's not a doctor. So, okay, Kohen Gadol Pem Sheposel Tenur Banan Hareni Kaparat Ben Biti Kuza. So this Baraita is imagining a grandmother who maybe we even combine these two cases, right? On the one hand, they has a grandson who's a Kohen Gadol who makes her not able to eat terumah. On the other hand, may have a mamzer that does allow her to eat terumah because keeps her connected with the Kohen. And so if we combine these two cases, we can have such a person that will say, may I be an atonement for my grandson who is a small jug, a derogatory term, meaning he's a mamzer. And let me be an atonement for him. To be an atonement for someone is a way of showing love. People say that if they lose a loved one, like a parent, and say, I be an atonement. I am unworthy to be related to them. And I wish them well. So she says, I'd be willing to sacrifice myself. That's really what it is, to sacrifice myself for this grandchild who is a mamzer, because at least his existence allows me to terumah. Ve'eni kaparat ben biti kada sheposleni mina terumah. But I refuse to sacrifice myself for the atonement of my other grandson here, who is a large jug. He's Kohen Gadol, but his existence makes me disqualified from eating terumah. And so, ironically enough, sometimes you can, someone who you normally think you'd be proud of to have a Kohen Gadol grandson can actually work in the negative and the other way around. Incidentally, it is possible to construct a case where both of these apply, although not at the same time, because one makes her eat terumah, one makes her not be able to eat terumah. But one after the other, one can have at different times in one's life a grandchild who is a mamzer and a grandchild who is a Kohen Gadol, and I guess we have to wonder which one she actually would prefer. Hazran alach almana. That concludes the 7th perek, and now we have to open up the next volume of the Kohen edition for the beginning of the 8th perek. Someone who is not circumcised for whatever reason, even if it's because he had a good reason to. For example, his older siblings died during circumcision. Nevertheless, he cannot eat terumah. Also, anyone who's tameh, any kohen who's tameh cannot eat terumah. However, neshehen ve'abdehen yochlu b'terumah. Their wives and their slaves can eat terumah. These are only temporary problems. He may be tameh today, but he'll become tahor tomorrow. But the point is, his household can continue eating terumah normally. There's no problem there. However, here's a bigger problem. Pesua daka uchrut shofcha hen ve'abdehen yochelu unshehen lo yochelu. Any man whose privates are damaged, we'll explain that further. They are not unfit to be a kohen in terms of eating terumah. And so therefore their slaves can also eat terumah. That's okay. The problem is that any man who has such a problem cannot marry into the Jewish community, cannot marry a regular Jew. And so therefore, unshehen lo yochelu, if they do get married, those wives are unfit and cannot eat terumah. On the other hand, let's say when he was healthy, he was totally fine when they got married. After they got married at some point, and years later, he had an accident and his privates were damaged. In that case, as long as they do not have another bi'ah, maybe they can't, he can't, or maybe they just don't yet, and so as long they're still married, and since they didn't have bi'ah, so he does not make her prohibited. So then he can eat and she can eat. That's fine. Once they do have bi'ah after such an accident, then he would make her prohibited, and she would have to stop eating terumah. How do we define exactly what this is, which the pasuk in Devarim says? Lo yavo pesua daka uchurut shofcha. The definition is kol shenifsua besim shelo. Anyone whose testicles have been damaged. Ve'afilu achat mehen, even only one. Uchrut shofcha, kol shenicherat hagid. Uchrut shofcha means anyone whose member was cut. V'im nishtayer me'atara afilu kechut hasa'ara kasher. But that's only if the shaft of the member itself was severed. As long as there is some part of the top of the corona, even a little bit, then that person is considered fine and can marry into the Jewish community. All right, that's the Mishnah. Now we're going to look for sources. Tanya Amar Rabbi Elazar minayin le'arel she'en ochel betruma. How do we know that someone not circumcised cannot eat teruma? The pasuk does not say so explicitly, but we learn it from a gezerah shavat to korban pesach. Ne'emar toshav v'sachir bepesach. Regarding korban pesach, it says kol eved ish miknat kasef umalta oto az yochal bo. Someone who has a household, a slave. If as long as one does circumcision, then that slave can even join with korban pesach. And furthermore, next pasuk, toshav and a sachir, a bound or hired labor. Gemara will define these terms. Cannot eat it. The point is here, it says the word toshav and sachir regarding pesach, who cannot eat it. It also says that same word, toshav v'sachir, regarding teruma. It says kol zar lo yochal. We already talked about that a lot. An outsider cannot eat teruma or kodesh. Toshav Kohen v'sachir lo yochal kodesh, and it also has toshav. This case has Kohen in the middle, even if he's a Kohen, and sachir also cannot eat kodesh. So since it has the same word here and there, we make a gezerah shava. Ma toshav v'sachir amor pesach arel asur bo, af toshav v'sachir amor betruma arel asur bo. And so therefore we connect them, and just like an uncircumcised person cannot eat teruma, so too an uncircumcised person cannot. Just like an uncircumcised person cannot eat Pesach, so too such a person cannot eat teruma. Okay. Rabbi Akiva omer eno sarich harehu omer ish l'rabot ha'arel. In the same braita, Rabbi Akiva says, "What a complicated connection you made there. I have a simpler way of deriving it. The pasuk regarding a tameh person, that is an explicit pasuk that someone who's tameh cannot eat teruma, because it says ish mizer aron vehu sarua ozav b'kodashim lo yochal ad asher yitar. Anyone who has sarat or zav, they are tameh, so they cannot eat teruma until they become pure. And this pasuk starts off with ish, that doubling of language. This is Rabbi Akiva's methodology. That double language comes to teach us something extra. So it's coming. What is it coming to add? It's coming to add an uncircumcised person also cannot eat teruma, and this braita, that's why it mentions them together here. Right? Harel bechol hatemeim. That would make sense for Rabbi Akiva. That's the end of the braita. Let's analyze it further. Amar mor Rabbi Eliezer omer ne'emar toshav v'sachir bepesach v'ne'emar toshav v'sachir b'truma. Ma toshav v'sachir amor bepesach arel asur bo. Af toshav v'sachir amor betruma arel asur bo. That's just a quote of the braita exactly. Where it says the word toshav and sachir regarding Pesach and regarding teruma, and so since regarding Pesach an uncircumcised person cannot eat it, so too teruma uncircumcised person cannot eat teruma. Now mufneh, we analyze this gezerah shava. It says it has to be that one of the phrases at least is available, is extra, that we don't need it for its context. The lav mufne, because if it's not extra, if it's not available to connect as a gezerah shava, ika lemifrach, then I would refute this gezerah shava. In other words, a gezerah shava, if the words are not extra, then we can only use a gezerah shava if it's foolproof. But if there's any logical argument against it, then the gezerah shava needs that at least one of the sides will be an extra word. That gives it more strength, because otherwise what's that word doing there? So if it's not going to be extra word, I will refute and say, Male Pesach sheken chayvin alav mishum pigul venotar vetameh. So I would say that Pesach is much more stringent. Look at all these laws that apply to Pesach that do not apply to Teruma. where Korban Pesach, if you'd have, can become pigul. If someone performs the rituals around Korban Pesach with improper intention to eat it outside of the proper time, then it becomes pigul. That's not true of terumah. There's no law of pigul in terumah. And also, Korban Pesach has to be eaten within a certain time and cannot be left over. Not true for terumah. There's no time limit on terumah. And also tumah. Now, even though tumah is prohibited in both, regarding Korban Pesach, this is a very severe prohibition. It's not such a severe prohibition for terumah. And so therefore, I would reject this gezerah shava because really Pesach is much more stringent, I might say. So we say in answer, layeh, afnuye mufneh. In fact, there is an available word. What's the available word? He mufneh. How is toshav sachir available? Which one is available? Truma misrach sericha. De tanya toshav ze kanui kinyan olam. Sachir ze kanui kinyan shanim. Regarding the context of teruma, I needed to say toshav and sachir. Because what are they? Toshav means someone, an eved ivri, who you acquire forever. Pierce his ear and he stays, not technically forever, but until the Yovel. As Sachir is an Eved Ivri that is acquired only for 6 years. So either of these, because it's an Eved Ivri, they are not owned. One does not own the body of an Eved Ivri. They're working for you. They can't decide to quit. That's true, but you only own their labor, not their bodies, unlike an Eved Kana'ani. So ironically, an Eved Kana'ani, because they are a lower status and there's ownership there, that they can eat terumah. But a Eved Ivri, because they are not owned, therefore they are their own people. They cannot eat terumah. They're not technically owned as part of the household. So I need that regarding in the case of terumah to teach me that toshav and sachir cannot eat terumah. Ve'yomar toshav va'al yomar sachir. Now hold on, we say even there isn't one of them extra. You can tell me toshav and don't tell me sachir. Va'ani omar kanui kinyan olam enochel kanui kinyan shanim glokol sheken. If someone who is indentured for life, meaning until the Yovel, and Eved Ivri until Yovel cannot eat, where the ownership is greater, and yet they are considered an independent person and not part of the household, or not owned by the household, and does not eat terumah. All the more so, someone who's a servant only for 6 years in Eved Ivri, all the more so is not really owned and therefore cannot eat terumah. So really, I only need to say toshav and I don't need to say sachir. So maybe the word sachir is extra. No. Ilu ken ayiti omer toshav ze kanui kinyan shanim. If I didn't have the word sachir, then I might think the word toshav means the one who's only for 6 years. Aval kanui kinyan olam ochel. But someone who indentures himself forever until Yovel would eat because they are more fully owned. So that's why I actually need both words regarding terumah. Neither of them are extra. I need sachir to tell me that toshav means the one that's kinyan olam, sachir is the one that's shanim, and both of them may not eat terumah. Okay, so that side of it is not extra. Ela de Pesach mufneh, but the side of the toshav and sachir that's mentioned by Pesach, that is in fact an extra word. Hi, toshav v'sachir, tekatav rachamana bepesach, maynihu. So let's analyze that. Who are these people that in Korban Pesach says that they cannot take part? Inema toshav v'sachir mamash mintum lehavale toshav v'sachir ipater le mi Pesach. Wait a second. If it's as we said above that this is talking about the Eved Ivri for 6 years or forever or for olam, so just because they are working for someone as an Eved, so then they are patur from Pesach. They are fully Jews, so of course they have to eat Korban Pesach. You wouldn't exclude them. It makes no sense. After all, toshav v'sachir do not eat terumah. Alma la kanile rabe, because their master does not actually own them. It's an eved ivri, whether for the 6 years or olam, since the master does not own their bodies, they're not owned by the household. Therefore, they do not eat teruma. They are independent beings. Hachaname la kanile rabe. So here too regarding Pesach, since the master does not own them, therefore they are fully Jews and independent and are required to bring korban Pesach. Therefore, we see that the words Tosav and Sachir regarding Pesach are extra. Interestingly, here, not only are they extra, but actually, when it says they do not eat Korban Pesach, it's actually the opposite. We have to remove these two words from the context altogether. And because Toshav and Sachir actually are required to eat Korban Pesach. Okay, so now we see that the Gezerah Sheva has extra words, at least on one side of it. The derivation from which we learn Toshav and Sachir regarding Pesach are extra, and therefore we will not refute it, as we tried to above. But nevertheless, vakate mufne misad echad, still this is only available extra words on one side of it. V'shaminan leRabbi Elazar damar mufne misad echad medin u'meshivin, and we understand that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a gezerah shava that has only one side of it free, only the words in one derivation are extra words, but the other one is not. So yes, you can learn this gezerah shava, but you can also refute it if there's a logical reason to refute it. And here we have that logical reason we mentioned above to refute it, and it's only free on one side. So how can we make it that there are extra words on both sides? כיוון דלגופה לצריך שדה אחד הלמד ושדה אחד המלמד והבל לגזר שם מופנה משני צדדים. We can do it because in fact there's two words, Toshav and Sachir, and both of them are extra regarding Pesach. So since we don't need these two words regarding Pesach, we can keep one word here at the place that we are learning from, and we'll take one of those words and transfer it over to teruma, that we are learning to, and therefore we have a gezerah shava that is in fact free on both sides, or at least it has two extra words that we can apply to both sides. So far, so good. Ima Pesach onen asur bo, af teruma onen asur bo. Hold on now. Now that you opened up the channel and you're learning from Pesach to teruma, why don't we learn as follows? Just like on Pesach in onen, someone whose loved one just died before burial does not eat korban Pesach. So why don't we learn the same thing through the gezerah shava and say teruma for teruma, onen also will not eat teruma, even though this halacha is not true. Onen can eat teruma, but why you would learn the same derivation? Amar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, Amar Kera v'chol zar, zarut amarti lecha v'lo aninut. Oh, we actually saw this already, that since the pasuk says that a zar cannot eat teruma, only someone is excluded from teruma only because he is a foreigner because he's an Israelite, not a Kohen, or other prohibited relations. So that's what will disqualify someone. But aninut will not disqualify someone from eating teruma. Okay, so we have that pasuk. That's why we're not going to learn from Pesach. Well, ve'ema ve'lo arelut. Well, if it says v'chol zar, only foreignness will exclude someone from teruma, but maybe not being circumcised should not disqualify someone from eating teruma. We could apply the same thing here, that zad will exclude an uncircumcised person from being a problem, and therefore an uncircumcised person can eat teruma. No, haketiv toshav sachir, but adelut, we learn from the gezerah shava toshav sachir from Pesach, and just like Pesach, you have to be circumcised, so to teruma you have to be circumcised. So now we ask, Kumaraita, why did you decide to include one and exclude the other? You could switch it around, and you can learn that arelut is from zar, and therefore an arel can eat teruma, and you can learn toshav sachir applies to aninut, and aninut cannot onen cannot eat korban Pesach and cannot eat teruma. Why did you pick this way around and not the other way around? And we answer, Mistabra adelut havalel raboye, sheken mechusar maaseh, umaaseh bigufo, ve'anush karet, ve'yeshnon lifnei dibur, umilat zecharav ha'abadav me'akebet. It makes sense that not being circumcised is the thing that we should be more machmir about, and say, just like Korban Pesach, you have to be circumcised. So too, to eat teruma, you have to be circumcised. Because after all, look how many other stringencies apply to someone who's not circumcised. We even have a mnemonic to remember them here. One is that you have to do in action in order to, if someone's not circumcised, they do in action. And that action is on their very body, that they have to do this little surgery here. And if you don't do it, Anush Karet, right? This is only this and Pesach are the two mitzvot aseh, Anush Karet. And this was commanded even before Matan Torah. Already the Avot had, the Avot and the generation that left Mitzrayim had to do Brit Milah, even before they got the Torah. That's how important it is. And in order to eat Korban Pesach, not only does the master, a household owner, have to have Brit Milah, but even his sons and his slaves also have to get Brit Milah. If any of a person's sons or slaves do not have a Brit Milah, then that owner cannot eat Korban Pesach. So you see how stringent it is. So it makes sense to apply the stringency to Brit Milah and not to Onen. But then we challenge, Adrabah, there are some ways in which Aninut is more also stringent. Aninut haved rabuyen. So maybe we should say that Onen cannot eat teruma. That's the one that we should be strict on. Sheken yeshna bechol sha'ah. And Onen can apply all the time. Brit Milah, well, you get only once in your life. But Onen, anytime someone's loved ones dies, even day or night will apply. Brit Milah is only during the day, so this is all time, at all times. Noheged ban nashim v'nashim. Both men and women can become an onen, even though only men have the requirement for circumcision. And regarding circumcision, a person can fix himself. You just go get one. All right, it only takes a minute. Whereas onen, it's not in your hands to make yourself non-onen. You have to wait till the chavira comes and the burial will happen. It's not something you can fix so easily. So therefore, you see, Aninut has a lot of different stringencies. Why not be stringent on Aninut? We say Hanach Nefishin. No, the ones for circumcision are still more than these. So therefore it makes sense to be prohibitive regarding circumcision. Teruma, no teruma if not circumcised, but onen, that's the one that we can include in what's permitted for teruma eating. Okay, Rava Amar, Belo hanach nefishan nameh lamasit amat. Rava says, yeah, I agree with the conclusion, but you don't even need this to compare stringencies. Even without that, I would still explain why we exclude someone not circumcised, but include an onen for eating teruma. Shavkinan arelu tichti b'gufeh de pesach v'yafyanut mi pesach de pesach gufeh ma'aser gamrinan. This gezerah shava. What is it comparing? It's going to Korban Pesach and teruma. Regarding Korban Pesach, that's where it says that an arel cannot eat Korban Pesach. It says that directly, so it makes sense to compare Arel regarding Pesach to Arel regarding Teruma, and not compare Aninut. Does not say explicitly in the Pesukim regarding Pesach that an onen is excluded. That we only learn from Ma'aser. So therefore, if we're making this Gezerah Shava, it makes much more sense to learn something that is directly mentioned regarding Pesach. Ima Pesach, but then we have another question. Milat zecharav avadav me'akevet after milat zecharav ve'abadav me'akevet. If you're going to learn that someone who has no brit milah cannot have korban Pesach, and therefore teruma also, well then we should learn something else about this very law. Because regarding Pesach, not only does a person himself has to have brit milah, but even all of his male sons and his servants. Otherwise, he cannot eat korban Pesach. So why don't we apply the same law? Once you open the Gezerah Shava, you learn from there, and say also regarding teruma, a Kohen cannot eat teruma unless all his sons also have brit milah and his slaves have brit milah. But we never saw that to be true. Markera umalta oto az yochal bo milat zecharav avadav mekevet bo melechol bepesach and milat zecharav avadav mekevet bitruma. Oh, we learn the limitation from the word bo. When you do circumcision, then he will eat it. He will eat it, meaning someone who has a circumcision and his whole household, his sons and his slaves, then he can eat korban Pesach. So the circumcision of all of his household is necessary for eating regarding korban Pesach. But if this comes to limit, and permit another case, and that is tiruma. So that's what we learned from the word bo. All right, well, once you open up this possibility, this methodology of learning from the word bo, 4 Pisukim later, it has an opposite formulation. And then from that, we could learn an opposite conclusion. Regarding still, Korban Pesach says anyone not circumcised cannot eat it. So we should also say this comes to limit something. This prohibition is limited prohibition. It says bo eno ochel aval ochel hu bitruma. So you can learn the opposite. It says so that someone who's not circumcised cannot eat Pesach, but he could eat teruma, and then we'll just learn that an adel can learn teruma altogether. No, you can't go that far because haketiv toshav v'sachir. That was the point of the original gezerah shava. Toshav v'sachir comes to say that someone is prohibited. Besides toshav sachir, it's adding also adel. So that would therefore we would not derive this permission from the word bo. Okay, now we ask umara ita, and why do you decide that you should include one but not the other? Why do you decide to learn from Pesach that if a person himself is not circumcised, he cannot eat teruma? Why not learn the other halacha that if a person's household is not circumcised, he cannot eat teruma? And it doesn't matter if he himself, in other words, the possibility that he could be uncircumcised, and as long as his household is circumcised, then that would be okay. We could learn one or the other. How do you know that the requirement is on the person eating, the Kohen eating himself, Teruma being circumcised, or the household? Well, we say mista, that makes sense because let's see which one is more stringent in general. The person eating Teruma, the Kohen eating Teruma himself, is more stringent because after all, he does it to his own body and he gets karet if he doesn't. Which is not true if his slaves don't get circumcision. Then we say no, adrabah, maybe circumcising his household is actually more stringent because that applies at all times. He himself, he has only one requirement of circumcision his whole life, but anytime he has another boy or requires another slave, he's going to continually have a requirement to circumcise his house. So this one is more stringent. So maybe we should say in order for someone to eat teruma, his household has to be circumcised. He doesn't have to be circumcised. And no, nevertheless we say hanach nefishin, the first list is greater than the second list, and so therefore he himself has to be circumcised, not his household for eating teruma. That's answer number one. Or v'ibedema belo hanach nefishan namelo masit amart. Even if it was not that the first group are greater in stringency than the second one, still I would not learn that way. This doesn't make sense. Can it be such a thing where someone's own circumcision does not matter and does not preclude him from eating teruma, but someone else's circumcision will preclude him from doing something? That doesn't make sense, right? The basic requirement will be he himself, and then the question is, should we extend it also to the person's household or not? So would it make sense only to apply to the household and not him, and therefore it only matters that the person himself is circumcised, a Kohen, then he can eat teruma, and does not matter if his household is circumcised, unlike regarding Korban Pesach. Okay, good. A couple more points. Hashta da'amart bo lidrasha hu da'ata kol ben echad lo yochal bo lamali. All right, now that we established just before that the word bo is going to always come to exclude something, that something applies only in this case but not something else. Well, if this pasuk that said regarding Korban Pesach that any foreigner cannot eat the Korban Pesach, it sounds like the foreigner cannot eat Korban Pesach but can eat something else. Well, what is that referring to, Lamali? So we answer, Bo mishumadut poselet ve mishumadut poselet b'maaser. What this foreigner is not only talking about a non-Jew, but also a Jew who apostatizes, who leaves his religion, is unfit and cannot eat Korban Pesach, cannot lo yochal bo. But that apostate can eat maaser sheni, and by the way, that would also include teruma, can eat teruma. It's not the same as Korban Pesach, which is an identity marker. You eat Korban Pesach, that means you are committed and fully identify with Bnei Israel, and that does not exclude that person from eating Maaser Sheni or Teruma. And lastly, Kol Arel lo yochal bo lamali. And so back again to Korban Pesach, where it says anyone who's not circumcised cannot eat it, Korban Pesach. Why does that have to? What is that coming to limit? Lamali bo eno ochel aval ochel hu b'masa umarod. It's true that someone who has no brit milah cannot eat Korban Pesach. However, they can still eat masa and maror and fulfill that obligation. It's only the Pesach, the meat of the Pesach itself, that they cannot partake in. But there's a separate mitzvah of matzah and maror, as we have today. Without Korban Pesach, we still fulfill this mitzvah. And so someone who does not, or even cannot, get a circumcision, still can fulfill matzah and maror. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen ve'amen.